Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. I'm about to tell you a story that some of you are going to find hard to believe. Very few of you will find it a matter of grave indifference. But some of you will just be shocked. But it's true. I want to tell you the story about the Immaculate reception and the part that I played in it. Now, to tell you that story, I've got to give you some background. You've heard me speak well of my lifelong love for the Pittsburgh Steelers. If you are younger, you may not realize this, but from 1933, when the Steelers began as an NFL franchise, until 1972, 40 years later, the Steelers had played in 0 playoff games. They played in a play-in game where if they had won, they would have gone to the playoffs, and they lost. But they never played in a playoff game. In 1972, the Steelers drafted in the first round a tailback, actually I should say a fullback from Penn State University, whose parents were African American and Italian, and his name was Franco Harris. As a boy, I thought he was Italian, that his name was Frank O'Harris. Well, Franco became an immediate star in the season of 1972, and his fan club was called Franco's Italian Army. And one of the members of that Italian army was none other than old Blue Eyes himself, Frank Sinatra, who came to a practice and was inducted into that army. I sent a letter to Franco asking if I could be inducted into that army. This is the first year that I'm paying attention to football. I'm 7 years old. So we got the background here. No playoff games. This great, young, new rookie who's so much a hero to me. I mean, I'm 7 years old. I'm not writing that well, but I am writing a letter to Franco to see if I could get in that army. Well, it happened in God's providence that this year the Steelers made the playoffs for the first time. And their first playoff game was being played on a Saturday at Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh. Now, to give you an idea how bad the Steelers were, for how long they were bad, the Steelers' first playoff game in 40 years did not sell out. Three River Stadium, a multi-use stadium in Pittsburgh, only sat about 50,000 people for football games, and yet it did not sell out. And because it did not sell out, and our home was in a 60-mile radius of the stadium, the game was blacked out. So I want you to picture my father. He is about 33 years old. And he is sitting in the kitchen of our home listening to this game on a transistor radio. Some of you are old enough to remember those sort of faddish transistor radios that were actually ball-shaped. They were round. They maybe had a little flat spot so it wouldn't roll away, but they were little round radios. And my dad had, I think, borrowed one that belonged to my sister. It was white, and he's sitting in the kitchen table listening to this game. Well, as much of a Steeler fan as I was as a 7-year-old, the idea of sitting at a table for 3 hours looking at a radio did not quite appeal to me. So I was busy playing with my sister. But I did care enough that I wanted to know what was going on. And what my sister and I were playing, I think there was somebody else, a friend of hers in the house, we were playing School. And even this was over Christmas break, and we're playing School. And every time my sister would say that it was time for recess, I would race out of her bedroom, down the hallway, across the living room, into the breakfast area, and ask my dad, "How's it going? What's going on, Dad? How's it going?" So I'm getting updated every 15 or 20 minutes or so during this game, which is a pretty close game. We're playing against the Oakland Raiders, whose quarterback was Kenny Stabler, whose coach was John Madden. Well, it's getting later in the day, and later in the day, and later in the day, and I get another recess, and I race over to my dad. I said, "Dad, how's it going?" And my dad was honest with me. He said, "It's not well, son. It's 4th down." By the way, if you don't know much about football, that means this is your last chance. It's 4th down. There's 12 seconds left. We have no timeouts. We're 60 yards away. We're down by 1. Doesn't look like we're going to do it this time, son. Now, this is the part you may find hard to believe. Everything so far that I've told you, you may find easy to believe. Those of you who are aware of what the Immaculate Reception was and is are not going to be shocked by what happened after what I'm about to tell you. But in between was this moment, this instant where something happened that should surprise you, and that some of you may find hard to believe. My father gives me his assessment, his account. And I looked at my dad, and I said to him, "Don't worry, Dad. Franco will do something great, and the Raiders won't have time to come back. Don't worry, Dad. Franco will do something great, and the Raiders won't have time to come back." Now, keep in mind, we're a long ways away from being able to score. You're not going to hand it off to your fullback in that spot. You're going to try to throw it downfield, maybe get one of your wide receivers open. Don't worry, Dad. Franco will do something great, and the Raiders won't have time to come back. So, what happens? Terry Bradshaw goes back for a pass. He is being assaulted by the defensive line of the Oakland Raiders. He's dodging, he's weaving, he's escaping, he's looking downfield and trying to find somebody open somewhere. And in desperation, he heaves the ball towards our tailback, Frenchie Fuqua. Somewhere around the Oakland 40-yard line, around the middle of the field. And just as the ball arrives, there's a great collision between Frenchie Fuqua, Jack Tatum, a defensive back for the Raiders, and the ball. And the ball bounces up in the air back towards the line of scrimmage of the Steelers. And as it's fluttering towards the ground, an inch off the turf, who should snatch the ball out of the air but Franco Harris, who ran it down the field for a touchdown, winning the game. No time left for the Raiders to come back. That catch of that bouncing ball came to be known as the the Immaculate Reception. It has on more than one occasion been deemed by sports writers across the nation as the greatest moment in the history of the NFL. If you were to fly into the Pittsburgh International Airport, you will walk by a life-size statue of Franco Harris picking that ball out of the air 1 inch off the ground. A huge event on par with Bill Mazeroski's bottom of the ninth inning 2-run home run to win the 1960 World Series against the New York Yankees. So if you heard of it, you heard of it. If you haven't heard of it, it's amazing. Either way, what's even more amazing is the honest truth that a 7-year-old kid in Western Pennsylvania, just before it happened, in the darkest moment of the game, for a franchise that had nothing but failure and frustration from its beginning, that 7-year-old kid said, "Don't worry, Dad. Franco's going to do something great, and the Raiders won't have time to come back." Now, the anticlimactic ending to the story is that the next week, the Steelers played against the Miami Dolphins, who during the regular season, at that point it was a 14-game season, had won 14 games, who'd won their first playoff game, who then defeated us and went on to the Super Bowl and won yet again against the Vikings, becoming the first and only team to ever go undefeated during the season and to win the Super Bowl. But that's okay, because that's not really the end of the story. In 1973, the Steelers went to the playoffs again. In 1974, the Steelers went to the playoffs again and won the Super Bowl. In 1975, the Pittsburgh Steelers went to the Super Bowl again and won. In 1976, the Steelers went to the playoffs again. In 1977, the Steelers went to the playoffs again. In 1978, the Steelers went to the playoffs and the Super Bowl and won again. The first team to win 3 Super Bowls. The next year, the Pittsburgh Steelers went to the playoffs, went to the Super Bowl, and won again. A dynasty was born that day. Now, was my faith, my optimism, my hope, was that instrumental in some way in what happened in God's plan? I have no idea. Could have been. It could have been. And if so, then maybe me retelling the story will mean good things for the Steelers this weekend as we start another journey to the Super Bowl. My father was a great writer. That said, there are 2 different voices that he spoke in when he wrote. And there was certainly overlap between these 2 voices, but there's also a distinction. The 2 voices are these. One, and this is probably what mattered most to me, but one, he could be a very inspiring writer. Those moments are less frequent in his rather extensive personal library of books that he's written, but they are beautiful and they are powerful. Books like The Holiness of God, and there are sections in The Holiness of God especially more so that are awakening, jarring moments. But more often than those moments of powerful, unction, soaked preaching moments, my father was a great teacher, including being a great teacher as a writer. In fact, I venture to guess that if you could, and I don't think you can, but if you could measure the impact across the church of the holiness of God, his book and teaching series, you would find that it is the second most impactful of his books and teaching series. And that first on that list, as powerful as the holiness of God has been, would be Chosen by God. But I'm not here today to talk about Chosen by God or Holiness of God. I am here to talk about another book by my father that I want to commend to you, which is called What is Reformed Theology? Now, its original title suffered from a weakness that I tend to have, where I want to give a title that's poetic and unclear. It was originally called Grace Unknown. But thankfully, the second time around, it got a much clearer title. What is Reformed Theology? Now, you may think that that's going to be a book that's going to be essentially redundant to his book Chosen by God, in Chosen by God, he defends the doctrine of the sovereignty of God, specifically in terms of our salvation, because the perspective out there is that the defining quality of Reformed theology is, those are the people that believe in predestination. And that's understandable, and it does matter, but it's not the fullness of what Reformed theology is all about. We have sometimes fun, sometimes pedantic arguments about what does it mean to be Reformed. Are you Reformed if you are a Baptist who believes in the 5 points of Calvinism? Are you Reformed if you believe in infant baptism but also believe in the continuing sign gifts? And we can tussle over who gets to wear the label. But one of the other great gifts of my father is that he was most zealous for those doctrines which encompassed these differing groups, whether it's Reformed Baptist or Calvinistic Baptist or continuationist Reformed people, whatever it is, those secondary issues to him were secondary issues. And what he wanted to deliver and teach and explain was garden variety, vanilla, ordinary, historic, Christian, Protestant, evangelical, Reformed doctrine. Nothing new, nothing speculative. And that's what you get in this book, What is Reformed Theology? You also get, happily, an acknowledgement of the reality that there are those who would not self-identify as Reformed in their theology, who are the sons of God, who've been embraced by and indwelt by the Holy Spirit, who have been brought into the family of God. He's not a sectarian or doctrinaire, but he is trying to be faithful to the Word of God, and he helps people. He explains things in ways that people can understand. You know, it was one of his favorite things was to say that if you can't explain it to a 7-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. Well, he could explain things to 7-year-olds because he really understood things. If you're interested in this idea, this position that we call Reformed theology, I cannot think of a better place to learn about it, a better person to learn about it than from my father. But as always, I want you to remember, as he would, that all we're trying to do is explain what the Bible teaches. That's it. We're not trying to be of Apollos or of Paul or of Peter. We're just trying to teach what the Bible teaches. So I commend it to you. It's brief. It's helpful. This is just, right down the middle of the standards that I set for the Curating Your Book Library segment. It is meaty without being difficult. It is helpful without being insignificant. It is easy to read without being light. Please check it out. What is Reformed Theology by R.C. Sproul. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.